Hello, everybody. Welcome to Lexington, Kentucky. Right in front of me is Lexington Cemetery, and this is one of the most historic cemeteries in the country. And there's a lot of interesting people buried here, so let's go take a look. One of the great things about this cemetery is the history, and I can't stress this enough. But just over here is going to be the final resting place of a man by the name of Henry Clay. Now, this is one of the most impressive tombs that I've seen throughout my years of exploring cemeteries. But for a little bit of information, Henry Clay was born in 1777. He was one of the earliest statesmen from the country, but he was an American lawyer. He was a politician. He represented Kentucky in both the U.S. Senate and the House of Representatives. He was the 7th House Speaker as well as the 9th Secretary of State. He ran unsuccessfully for president in 1824, 1832, and in 1844, and he helped found both the National Republican Party and the Whig Party. So he was a very influential politician in his day. He was certainly very important in Kentucky here. But as you can see, they do have this locked, but you can look in here, and there he is, in a sarcophagus above ground, which you don't see too often these days. And I believe that's his wife to his right. But it's a pretty impressive monument. I mean, this is one of the biggest tombs that I've ever seen, especially for somebody who was never actually president of the United States. But this is one impressive monument. And he's only one of many, many historic names buried here. There is a very well-known actor. Actually, there's a couple of actors here. But as you see, people leave coins and things like that here. And I'll walk around this tomb just to give you a little bit of a feel as to how big this actually is. I know a lot of this stuff doesn't show on camera exactly how big it actually is. I believe it is just Henry Clay and his wife occupying this tomb here too. So this is kind of a lot for two people, but I mean, his importance here is... you can definitely tell by the size of this tomb. Just over here is the final resting place of a legendary comedic actor, and this guy, to me, was a big part of my childhood, but this over here is Jim Varney. And if that name doesn't ring a bell, he played Ernest P. Worrell in all the Ernest movies. Ernest Goes to Camp, Ernest Goes to Jail, Ernest Scared Stupid, Ernest Saves Christmas. These are classic films, and he was a little bit of a goofy character, but I mean, he really brought this character to life. And if you didn't know him from those, he played Jed Clampett in the film version of the Beverly Hillbillies. He voiced Slinky Dog in the first two films of Toy Story. But he was a really, really talented guy. He could do comedy, he could do drama. He was a classically trained actor, just a very, very good actor, and boy was he funny. But he unfortunately passed away pretty young. He died of lung cancer February 10th of 2000 at the age of only 50, and his parents are here beside him. But this is the final resting place of comedic actor and earnest actor Jim Varney. Over here is one of the more historic names here, and it's marked with the Todd family plot. Now, these were Abraham Lincoln's in-laws. Now, these were Mary Todd's parents, Robert Smith Todd and Eliza Todd. And Mary was born here in Lexington, Kentucky, to Robert Smith Todd and Eliza. And her mother died when she was very young. I believe she was 6 years old when her mother passed away during childbirth. And she came from a very, very wealthy family. They lived in a 14-room house here in Lexington, Kentucky. And her father ran a dry goods store. He dealt in liquor, brandies, and Dutch gin. He was heavily involved in politics. And this right here is Eliza's grave. Now, she passed away very early on. Her and Mary didn't know each other real well, but this was Robert's grave right here, and it looks like these weren't taken very good care of over time, but they were a very wealthy family, and Robert passed away in 1849. So he would have known Abraham Lincoln, but not real well. One of the interesting things about this cemetery is the history, and I can't stress this enough. There are some beautiful memorials and monuments here. This here is Joel Higgins. What a beautiful monument. Over here we have one of the other more visited grave sites here at the cemetery, and that would be of John C. Breckinridge, probably best known as Vice President of the United States. And he is also labeled here with a marker. But John Breckinridge was born in 1821 here in Kentucky, just outside of Lexington, and he represented Kentucky in Congress. He was the 14th Vice President of the United States under President James Buchanan, and he was also the youngest Vice President at the age of 36 years old. Now, he served in the U.S. Senate at the outbreak of the Civil War, and he was expelled after joining the Confederate Army. He was appointed Confederate Secretary of War under Jefferson Davis around 1865, not too long after the war ended. But he ended up leaving the country and went overseas for the next few years, and he ended up passing away in 1875 at the age of only 54 years old. He led a pretty interesting life, though, and he had a lot of interesting stories that went along with his life. So if you're not familiar with him, look into his life a little bit. It's definitely worth the read. But this is John Breckinridge. From the road, this one caught my eye a little bit too, so we'll walk up and check it out. But this one's labeled Dunlap. John B. Dunlap and Emily. Died in 1880, but another beautiful memorial. Over here is an interesting character from the Civil War. This is John Hunt Morgan, and I love how they label some of these so that you can find them from the street. But John Morgan was born in 1825 in Alabama, and he was a Confederate general in the Civil War. He raised the 2nd Kentucky Cavalry Regiment, and he fought at the Battle of Shiloh, and he launched a costly raid in Kentucky. He set out on a 1,000-mile raid into Indiana and Ohio, and they took hundreds of prisoners. Now, most of his own men were intercepted on U.S. Army gunboats, and Morgan surrendered in Salineville, Ohio, but it was the northernmost point ever reached by ununiformed Confederate soldiers. Now, he carried out the Morgan's raid against all orders, and he pretty much lost all credibility at this point. I believe he narrowly escaped prison, but he was never looked at the same way again, and he never got any real orders after the fact. But he was killed in Greenville, Tennessee in September of 1864, and he was only 39 years old. But he was kind of a Civil War legend, I guess you could say. But he is documented here as being one of the more visited grave sites here at Lexington Cemetery. Here's just a little more beauty of this cemetery, and this is why I love coming through old cemeteries, because you don't see things like this very many places, especially modern. But this one's labeled Payne. I really have no idea whose this is, but this is a beautiful monument here. It's amazing detail. Here's one other one that happened to catch my eye from the road. Another one you really don't see much of. It's labeled Stockham, but it's a boy with an umbrella. Pretty neat sculpture. Now, to me, one of the more interesting people laid to rest in the cemetery is over in the mausoleum wall, and that was a man by the name of Ralph Foody. And if that name doesn't sound familiar, he was an actor. He was born in 1928 in Chicago, and he was best known for roles in Home Alone and Home Alone 2. Now, he wasn't in the movie itself, but he was in the fictitious movie that Kevin McAllister was watching called Angels with Filthy Souls. He played a guy named Johnny in the fictitious film, and his catchphrase in the film was, "Keep the change, you filthy animal." And that was one of the more recognizable scenes from the movie, although it was pretty much a fake movie that was made for Home Alone. He passed away in Lexington, Kentucky at the age of 71. Thanks for joining me on this tour of Lexington Cemetery in Lexington, Kentucky. Hopefully you learned a thing or two about the folks that we talked about today. Thanks so much for joining today, and we'll catch you on the next video. Take care, everybody.